Hey everybody, I'm Eric Gerlach, and this is another talk on Greek philosophy, specifically Greek skepticism and the early skeptics, Pyrrho and Anaxagoras. We will then be giving a talk on Sextus and later Greek skepticism. The word skeptic originally comes from inquirer and comes from Greek. So when we say skeptical, much as we say Epicurean and or hedonistic and or this or that, we are using words that are generally used for personalities and angles on humanity. Skepticism, as opposed to dogmatism, both of these are originally Greek words. Hegel believes that a later German thinker in the 1800s, very important for German and then French and modern thought, says that the great battle in the history of philosophy and all of human thought is the battle between objectivity and subjectivity, dogmatism and skepticism. Specifically that we have understanding and knowledge and we want to hold that rigid, but we also want to have open-ended reasoning and speculate. So we are back and forth between what I sometimes like to lovingly refer to as a combination picnic knife fight between an older conservative guy and a younger hippie girl, somewhat, to present opposite types, such that we want to be rooted and firm, but we also want to reach towards the heavens and move all around in the VW bug van. VW van, I suppose, not so much the bug. But yes, essentially, we have here the skeptics, and the skeptics are against the dogmatists, as Sextus is against everyone, as we will talk about. So Pyrrho, who lived sometime between 360 and 270 BCE, he is slightly after some of the earlier philosophers that we have talked about, but he is not the last of the Greek skeptics, is the greatest skeptic of ancient early Greece, was from Elis, the northwest of Athens on the Dorian Peninsula. Diogenes Laertius, the Greek in Roman times, who is the biographer of the philosophers, says Pyrrho was originally a painter, an interesting profession for a thinker who argues that reality is appearances and human judgments are images that never quite capture the original. As in, things are models or images in our heads. Originally, the word skeptikos means inquirer, as said, someone who investigates continuously. As I often like to say, subjectivity is not about no truth at all. Many a time it's, I believe in subjective truth. Oh, that's no truth at all then. Well, then what is is that subjective lies or is that subjective zero? Because I thought it said subjective truth in words. If you're a pragmatist, the positivist may say the pragmatist believes in nothing. The pragmatist says, a la Wittgenstein, who called himself reluctantly a pragmatist, I'm doing what's fruitful. I'm not doing nothing. So the skeptic says truth is subjective, says I can argue that better than anybody and show you a lot about it. So unfortunately, this is somewhat relativism, and online there's many a person who wants to say the relativist knows nothing, not some, but none, which is actually all or none viewed dogmatically, rather than some and some viewed relativistically and skeptically. So in the same way, a painter paints an image, the image is somewhat truth, but also somewhat false, because it's a somewhat true representation, but also is merely a representation. But it is something. So, as we have discussed with previous thinkers, such as Xenophanes, Heraclitus, Democritus, and Socrates, skepticism is often portrayed by more dogmatic thinkers as pessimistic nihilism, a dreary attitude that no knowledge is possible. But while skeptics are often quite optimistic, in fact, as Socrates is, I mentioned he is more the optimistic skeptic as Plato's early character. He then turns more dogmatic and Pythagorean. But he is not a skeptical nihilist like Thrasymachus. He says, no, we can pursue towards the good. I just am insistent. I do not know what it is and is all vague and non-conceptual, but more of a feeling, more like intuitionism, as I mentioned, than something like a definite concept with definition, or clear words that simply parse it out, which we have more or less against in Plato's later dialogues. So, while skeptics are relativists, critical of claims to absolute universal knowledge from humanity, skeptics are passionate about seeking relative truth, sides of the elephant, which are real sides of the elephant, which they argue is a continuous source of insight and engagement. Clearly, inquirers believe that there is no good end to inquiry, no end to what we can discover, including... I have a curious cat who has not been killed. Not at all. I almost got him there, which a buddy, and I will play with him later. Yes. Well, he's not curious enough for that. So yes, he's going to figure more toys out, hopefully with little noise. So, as a young painter, Pyrrho became fascinated with philosophy through the works of Democritus, the atomist who was quite skeptical of human judgments in spite of his atomic theory, which he definitely seems, like Heraclitus says, well, all is fire, by the way, I'm a skeptic, that all is atoms, by the way, I also am a bit I question human claims to knowledge. Democritus says, reason is a powerful persuader, not perfectly convincing. And about the gods and the workings of the heavens, man is what we know, which is not... Protagoras says man is the measure of all things. Democritus says man is what we know, which is somewhat similar here. Well, as Confucius said, you don't know how to feed the living. How are you going to feed the dead exactly? Even though Confucians do like rituals to the spirits. Critical of knowledge, Pyrrho said we should have much thought rather than much learning, and said in reality we know nothing, for truth is in the depths. That is, like Heraclitus says, nature loves to hide and things keep their secrets, which is an alternate translation. Also, like Heraclitus, Democritus said the world is change, life is opinion, and the world is a stage, life is our entrance, you came, you saw, you left. Pyrrho was acquainted with the paradoxical thought of the Eleatics, which he learned from the Megarian school, founded by a follower of Socrates. I do like you came, you saw, you left is kind of veni vidi vici, but you don't conquer, you just, you exit stage left here. Pyrrho traveled with his teacher, Anaxarchus, who was a follower of Democritus, who was decently skeptical, but also an atomist. And those atoms and their orders, they do match up with Indian systems. And Alexander, Pyrrho traveled with Anaxarchus and Alexander, whom Anaxarchus was hooked up with. Student of Aristotle, who we just had, and emperor to Persia and India. Some sources say as a soldier, and others say that Pyrrho traveled as a scholar. Alexander failed to conquer India. I am going to do a talk on Ashoka and his grandfather fighting Alexander back and forth, which is India tied to Greece soon. Unlike he had Egypt and Persia. Alexander conquered Egypt and Persia. He never got India in his pocket. So it is said that Pyrrho learned from the Persian Magi. Those are the three who visited supposedly the baby Jesus. Well, not just the three, but those would be three of them. As well as the Indian gymnosophists or hymnosophists, depending on how we want to pronounce the hard or soft G. A hymnosophist seems to be a Greek term for Indian strivers, please watch my Indian philosophy videos, who are starting to be the Jains and the Buddhists, but may not be yet. And they may not just speak the language to talk to them and figure out whether they're Jains or Buddhists. But what they are seeing as they go into India is supposedly Pyrrho saw on his travels people who were disciplining the body and disciplining the mind. And he saw this, and he came back and would sit outside Athens and outside the gates, and he would question everyone and argue any position with anybody and then flip sides, which sounds a lot like super skepticism, which he may or may not have picked up somewhat from India, which would be like the Jains and the Buddhists saying many sides of the elephant, which we get the elephant from Muslims who get it from Indians, and then we get our expression through the Brits into English. And they're goings about all over the world and in the Middle East and in India. So these hymnosophists, these body-mind trainee type, hymnosoft means gymnastic sophist, so somebody who's body-mind trainer, sort of, that these could have been the Jains or Proto-Jains, and they are known for logical debate, as well as extreme practices of bodily discipline, sometimes fasting for standing in the jungle in days. Again, Bahubali is supposedly the first Jain to achieve total enlightenment in this cycle of, in this kalpa, in this cycle of existence, and he did it. How did he do it? Well, he was embarrassed over his brother's pride and beating his brother at everything, so he went and stood in the jungle for a year. Vines grew up his body while he was naked. There's an image, unfortunately, I show. And yes, there are several of him naked with vines growing up his body in the jungle, and he is sort of the proto-Buddha, except he's not seated. He stood in the jungle for a year. Hopefully took a break, had a trail mix or something. But yes, the Taoists say if you eat nothing but trail mix, you can effectively be immortal in the hills or in the jungles. And yeah, He basically got the enlightenment of the Buddha before the Buddha, according to the Jains, and he did it by standing for a year in the jungle. Statues of Jain teachers frequently show vines growing up their naked bodies because they go radically without in order to discipline the body and the mind, so no clothes. Sources, and it's easier in the jungle, honestly, than up in the mountains of China or in Greece, along the coast. Sources say one Indian hymnosophist set himself on fire to go willingly to death, which terrified Alexander and his entourage. It is, in the Indian tradition, it is more acceptable in the Indian tradition and in the Buddhist tradition, which then branches off into East Asia, to say, well, it's time for me to go, and then stop eating is usually the thing that is done, and you then effectively die. Now, old people, of course, I have had older relatives, and unfortunately, when people do stop eating, they often say, well, maybe get the family together. Much love to everyone, especially in this time. And so actually, that's not the weirdest thing, but actually in the Indian tradition, it is much more accepted. Okay, this is your time to die. So, okay, you know what I mean? We're going to be cool. But yeah, I am going to, even if I feel like eating, I'm going to stop eating. I'm going to sit in meditation, and I am going to tune myself until death. That's far more. In fact, you have Buddhist monks in China, I believe, who are somewhat mummified, who sit there, and again, are somewhat mummified in practice. Again, that could be kind of horrifying. Always here it is good to mention Rage Against the Machine, the album cover, which of course many Americans know of, the Buddhist monk who set himself on fire. Just as a minor point, he actually, what happened was the temporary president of Vietnam said Buddhists could not have any Buddhist ceremonies, but then went and had a public Catholic ceremony in the streets. America took over Vietnam from the French and the French Catholics. And so when that Buddhist guy saw the French Catholic president of Vietnam, or temporary, leader, basically give Catholic ceremonies rather than Buddhist ones, he said, this is white people and Christianity coming to take away Buddhism, and even though the Buddhists are not so into communism, and he set himself on fire, which of course is protesting the Americans in Vietnam, but it's actually specifically protesting, he thought that Christianity was coming by way of Americans into East Asia and was trying to wipe out Buddhism. And so he set himself on fire to protest both the American involvement as well as Catholic encroachment on Buddhism. That's something I actually only learned later in doing Buddhist philosophy. Sorry for the tangents again. But it is appropriate here because supposedly Pyrrho, before he went and sat outside of Athens and argued anybody with anybody, he would have heard these Jains. Somebody was trying to translate what these Jains are arguing and saying, and then they saw somebody effectively, throw themselves on the funeral pyre, somewhat like the widows are supposed to do. And yeah, that freaked out the Greeks something fierce. Not because they thought it was evil necessarily, but because that's serious discipline and ability. People do believe in falling on their sword at this time, so that is quite powerful. And again, please do not, obviously, yes. With all of that, I do always caution against suicide. Unlike, Danny DeVito, a la It's Always Sunny, and say it's not so, it's not so bad jackass. Yes? So don't do that. Not so badass jackass. So after returning to Elis, Pyrrho chose to live a simple life of poverty, but he was known in both Elis and Athens for his skill at debate, and the Athenians went so far as to offer him citizenship and construct a statue in his honor after his death. The people of Elis offered Pyrrho the job of chief priest, believing his command of truth to be divine, and to honor him made philosophers exempt from taxation. I'm all into it. I have rent control here, but that's not just for philosophers. Pyrrho wrote nothing, though his work was recorded by his student Timon, not the meerkat of the Lion King, although that would certainly be weird and amusing. And then his skepticism was elaborated much later by Sextus Empiricus, from whom we know Pyrrho's thought, because he did not write anything down and a lot was destroyed. Sextus is the first guy a couple hundred years later who I believe is as we'll get to, a Greek in more Roman times, who is saying this is what Greek skepticism is all about. By the way, I got to write all this down because a bunch of people don't know. So we actually get all of this stuff somewhat second, third, fourth, and all of that hand from Sextus much later. And I'm going to keep calling him Sextus. And again, as always, I could joke, Sextus Empiricus was not an ancient Roman porn star, although it does seem it. Jains, the good candidates for the hymnosophists Pyrrho met in India, advocate two principles that are shared with Indian thought but credited to Jain innovation: Anekantavada, the multiplicity of reality, or non-one-endedness, and Sayadvada, the hypothetical and imperfect nature of perspective and judgment. Technically, I have three. We'll just stick to those two for right now. According to these principles, all human beliefs and judgments are temporary and partial views of the elephant, of each particular thing and the self and the cosmos. Like Buddhists, Jains believe that many things may or may not be as they seem and may or may not be expressible as they are both. So Pyrrho's skepticism is summed up under the term akatalepsia, alternatively, withholding judgment. Now, as with Wu Wei of the Taoists, who are also skeptics very much, non-action here means acting less, and there is the pun on saying non-action. It's like, oh, you want us to never act. No, less act, and non-action is less action. Withholding judgment is not completely withholding judgment, otherwise you could not argue anything with anybody. But you are withholding judgment far more so than most do, relatively speaking. And language, of course, is, we are highly dogmatic creatures and black and white, so while these guys are trying to get shades of gray in between black and white, they will use words that then often are interpreted as absolute all or none, and they are doing that, I believe, somewhat on purpose, examining human language and philosophy. So withholding judgment here is less judgment is better, which is very like Taoists, Jains, and Buddhists, and I have many a talk this semester even on all of that. Like Zeno, Pyrrho taught that any belief can be countered by the opposite belief which contradicts it. Thus, like the Jains, Pyrrho held that reality is not one-sided, like human judgments, and that all judgments are partial and should be treated as hypothetical, as best guess. While some in ancient or modern times might accuse Pyrrho of being a sophist, of being a destroyer of truth who merely argues any side skillfully but for money without any pursuit of truth, Pyrrho is not being paid much at all. He, like the Eleatics and Socrates, believed that seeing the limitation and contradictions inherent in all sides of truth, in all positions of human judgment, brings one closer to the full truth, giving one the God's eye view, as far as mortally possible. Recall Aristotle said skeptics are no better than plants, essentially do not develop, and prefers universal certainty because if you know A to B to C, you know that for all time, and you don't have to be relativistic and say somewhat A, somewhat not A, somewhat B, somewhat not B, so therefore somewhat not C possibly. If you clear out A, B, C, well, you don't have to be skeptical or relativistic about that at all. The skeptics would say, and we remain open and don't know if A or not A next week, so we A or not A next week, so we certainly don't know B or C just yet and have to keep our eyes open. Too much trust brings affliction, as the ancient Egyptian text says. Keep your eyes open. Too much trust brings trouble. Just as Socrates' knowledge that we are mortals or ignorant was considered divine, as in Plato's Apology and Symposium, where it is portrayed as divine and spiritual, being psychically in tune with the spirits and the cosmos, Pyrrho, like Parmenides in Plato's dialogue of that name, argued each side knows that each side is ignorant and limited. Each side knows that from the other side. Just as Socrates in Plato's Meno argues we can pursue the good though we don't know what it is, knowing and not knowing it both, in a strange form. Pyrrho put this into practice like Parmenides says, and suggests to boy Socrates, arguing both sides until he becomes unstoppable outside of Athens. Here again, Diogenes would have thought himself the true legitimate heir of Socrates, whether or not he liked any of Plato's dialogues, including the Parmenides. So Pyrrho would point to the continuous fact of differences of opinion amongst both the foolish and the wise in order to show this. Both the foolish and the wise constantly argue amongst themselves, the fools with the fools, the wise with the wise, and of course the fools and the wise with each other. So this shows both the educated and the uneducated have various opinions in spite of being educated or not. Pyrrho argued that each thing is both this and that, and neither this nor that. This is very similar to the Katuscoti, the four things, kat, a la French, and the Indo-European language family, Katuscoti of Nagarjuna, who argues each thing is not, and neither is nor is not, and explicitly gives those as the forms of his logic and debate. And Pyrrho is very similar because he is skeptical. Again, I will say here again, I do believe there are human psychological forms of dogmatism and skepticism, but I leave that rather loose and suggest, well, of course there are, because you've seen people believe and doubt things. But what that exactly are, I like covering ancient thought, of course, a bunch. I haven't met many neurons lately in person, so I argue about it from ancient and modern skepticism and dogmatism and say, how does all that work and not? So when these Indian thinkers are like the Greek thinkers, of course, that's not just accidental because Pyrrho went to India. But when he is like Nagarjuna, that could be because they both share human minds and forms of life. So consider the example of fire being hot. If a fire is so much hot, but it's not plasma of a star, then fire is hot, but it's also not hot relative to the star, so it is and is not hot, you can conclude, number 3, but then it is neither completely hot nor completely not hot. And other than saying it is completely not hot or completely not hot, Consider, for instance, the image of a fire on a screen can be hot, but is also not hot in the way you might assume a fire on a screen is. So it is hot and not hot, and if the screen heats up, that's not because it's a fire as opposed to an icy waterfall on the screen. So that would be an example complexly of something in a twist in a different way. I'm not suggesting that's his, but if something that is more Indian a bit. If something is an image of something, or if I'm an actor, I play an amazing villain, somebody says, wow, Eric's a real villain. Yes and no, because I'm actually a decent guy, and I don't go, but I play one on TV, not the decent guy. Not that at all. So again, is and is not, in different ways together, which is confusing, but you can parse out with debate and conceptualization and words talking stuff out, good or not. So, in Plato's Parmenides, he says, if you do this kind of thing, you will become unstoppable. And again, Pyrrho may have had a bit of debate with Indians and then had much debate with Athenians and others as he wandered around upsetting everyone. Legend has it, Pyrrho would defeat anyone in argument and then take his opponent's position and say, by the way, let me argue that better than you did, and then he will turn right around and defeat his own position better than anyone else could that he earlier had. Because if you believe there's truth on all sides of the elephant, then you would show that to people while further being open-minded and further inquiring forever, which is sort of the Sisyphean task of humanity and quite noble for the skeptic. Not being no better than a plant, but being the best, largest monstera plant possible. Pyrrho believed that seeing this theoretically and then putting it into practice, exercising, as Plato's Parmenides suggests, brings peace of mind and freedom from fear, what Pyrrho and later Pyrrhonians call ataraxia, a state of tranquility. I do argue extensively elsewhere, much of skeptical thought and philosophy is not aimed after happiness. We just had that also with Aristotle. It is aimed at tranquility, and then tranquility often brings happiness with it. That is the slight smile of the Buddha. There is an image of the Buddha being kind of like Buddy Christ from Dogma and being like, but that's weird because the Buddha is not supposed to be excited roller coaster. The Buddha is chill. He's cool, man. In fact, cool has correlates across human languages. Some have said it comes from African languages into jazz. Perhaps. It also is cool and tranquil and calm is a very nice state indeed for humanity. Whether or not the jazz slang does come from African slang and otherwise, or African communities in America, which it very well could, being cool and calm and tranquil, man, is more important than being roller coaster happy because you're keeping your ducks in a row and you're stacking yourself upright. It isn't about maxing happiness, excitement-wise, as much as it is being truly at peace. Epicurus, even though Epicurus puts happiness as the highest value, certainly talks like this in that he does not believe roller coaster happiness or heroin is what you're going after. He certainly wouldn't have believed that at the time because, even though now that I think about it, heroin puts you way too at peace, don't it? But it doesn't keep you happy for a very long time, as far as I know, for 3 days wholly, because that is not lasting happiness, and lasting happiness for Epicurus would be you cannot live wisely without living happily, or happily without living wisely, because for Epicurus, even for him and the Epicureans, who many consider utilitarian hedonists, they would be aimed more at peace, and peace-bringing happiness, than outright utter happiness just blasting, out of yourself. Because that's not what the point actually of life is, according to a lot of thinkers, whether or not you or I believe them. In Greek, this is known by the skeptics as ataraxia. And the Stoics, who believe in collecting objective knowledge, unlike the skeptics, and don't like the skeptics, their ultimate goal is ataraxia. Here in the Greek philosophy class, we will be ending with 3 powerful philosophies. That's skepticism, Epicureanism, and Stoicism. And all of them, decently like Plato and Aristotle, do not believe happiness is the highest goal, but it often tarries along with it. Why? Because you are getting your ducks and your pyramid and yourself in a peaceful, tranquil, solid-based row. A la the totem pole. So you're not outright just rock star, blasting happy, because peace and tranquility and balance between extremes. Again, notice the skeptics do not believe Aristotle, who's rather dogmatic about things, is balanced enough to see fire as hot and not hot, which unfortunately upsets all of Aristotle's perfect syllogisms decently, as we can talk out more with logic. So Pyrrho because things are non-one-sided, appearing to us as one-sided but then as two-sided, we must ask ourselves what our relationship to the truth is and how we should approach life. Pyrrho believes a life of simplicity and being emotionally detached and at peace, similar to Greek philosophers we have already studied, as well as the Epicureans and Stoics we will study next week. He is like them, but he also disagreeing with Pyrrho. He believes that the practical goal of life is this attainment, not necessarily objective certainty. This is, if you notice, the slight smile of the Buddha, similar to India, the Jains, and the Buddhists, whom either Pyrrho talked with or talked with people who are going to become plenty of that. So some sources critical of Pyrrho said that wherever he went, he needed to be chaperoned by friends so he would not skeptically try to walk off the sides of a cliff or in front of chariots or wagons. This sounds like a story told by his enemies. This definitely sounds like people said, oh, that guy, he didn't believe in anything, therefore he would walk in front of chariots to show, no, I can totally live. Watch this. Yeah, that is something actually you find is people like, oh, well, then you should just put all your money in a pile and burn it then if everything and nothing is true. And of course the skeptic would be like, now, is that cautious piece to put all your money in a pile and burn it because you're all angry? Is that skepticism? I don't think it is, pal. Is that many sides of the elephant? Burn all the money right now? The Buddha says the Jains are trying to burn off their self completely and hate themselves too much. That's not skepticism. That's not balance. That would be similar here if you said, oh, Pyrrho, then walk off a cliff. He's like, no, as Thales says, I believe Thales says there is no difference. And again, well, why not kill yourself? Because there is no difference. You know what I mean? Yes, works full circle. Now, no chariot or wagon is absolutely solid, so maybe you could get right through the middle of it, nor is walking off a cliff certain death, because you could survive. In fact, people survive, skydiving sometimes. Well, when their parachute doesn't employ, I wouldn't try it. When Pyrrho argues that our understandings are mere appearances, this does not mean he believes in walking off of cliffs, though. If he did, this would be very stupid skepticism, but it sounds like this is his opponents. And remember, the schools stayed on for a while, so were they all walking off of cliffs in front of people? Probably not. Anaxidemus founded Pyrrhonism on Peronean Skepticism as a school in the 1st century BCE. Continuously angering more dogmatic thinkers and schools of thought, Pyrrhonians were known for relativizing every assertion with "it seems that" or "it appears to be that," rather than state categorically what is the truth. Critical of the logic of Aristotle and his peripatetic walking about school, the Pyrrhonians argued there are no truths that can be absolutely asserted, all x is y in all times, or absolutely denied, no x is y. Those are corners of the square of opposition of Aristotle's logic. All that we know, given our limited perspective and ability to gather knowledge through experience, is what can be relatively asserted. Some x is y, or relatively denied. Some x is not y. Those together, all, none, some, and some not, are the 4 corners of Aristotle's square of opposition. I will be doing work about how I think those are the royalty of Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. And Lewis Carroll's trying to teach children the most basic baby's Aristotelian logic. I will get to that this weekend. All that we can know, given our limited perspective, is some and some not neither, all, nor none. These are forms I would suggest, as I have for years. It seems like this kind of form is something India, Greece, China, and human. And I have many a talk on this, and I am certainly not the last one, nor is Sextus or Pyrrho, to say anything about this, although there are very simple pieces we interweave in our lives centrally, without pause, all day long, questioning and answering things, trusting and distrusting others, such that all, none, some not. There is an interesting difference between our uses of general and universal here. When Aristotle says general or universal, when we translate what Aristotle says is either general but then also universal, it sounds like general, we use the word as generally x is y. That's some and some. You could have most x is y, but that's still some and some, not all or none. But when you say universal, that more sounds like mathematical absolute. So it sounds like all horses have 4 legs. If I say generally horses have 4 legs, that sounds like I mean some sort of don't. There are 3-legged horses and they don't always shoot horses, do they? But if we basically have universally all horses have 4 legs, that means if it does not have 4 legs, it is not a horse. And that is a problem with Aristotle's logic and back and forth with skepticism and dogmatism. Because if you define a horse as a living thing with 4 legs, once it's no longer alive or doesn't have 4 legs, it is no longer a horse, not even, one could say, a dead horse. Or technically a dead horse cannot be a horse at all. We use language in messy overlapping ways, though, that are not entirely categorical. And here I will have you see Wittgenstein and a bunch of stuff I have not yammered about just yet, but will very soon, because that is what I love and makes a lot of sense of all this. So if Aristotle says X is generally Y, he could, again, in the translations and the problems with the text, we use the word general to mean something like loosely plenty. But for more Aristotle, he means black and white the best you can get it, such that horses by nature have 4 legs, and there aren't 2-legged horses around a bunch in species of 2-legged horses, is what he means. And how do we talk out all of that, ourselves and others? So Pyrrho did not deny the second sort of statement that relatively generally all is everything, but again, he would deny universals, and technically Aristotle is arguing for universals. If it is a fire, it is never cold, and it isn't, in a certain sense, the sort of round its fires are not relatively hotter and hotter. You build a larger bonfire, it's hotter. Technically, fire is hot. And if you say only how hot jumps so high, now you've become somewhat of a relativist about it, and it's not as hot as the plasma of a star. So between the death of Pyrrho in 270 BCE and the time of Sextus Empiricus, and we'll focus the next thought on him and him against this, against you, against everybody, dang it. 400 years later, there is a limited evidence of a Pyrrhonian tradition that survives. They didn't all walk in front of chariots and off cliffs. While Pyrrho wrote nothing, Pyrrho's student Timon, again, not the meerkat, who lived with Pyrrho for many years in Elis, left behind fragments of poetry. Again, he sounds like Homer and Hesiod and early philosophers who write poetry and song, which are found in the works of other philosophers and historians. Excuse me. Timon wrote that what our senses and mind tell us, our sensations and conceptions, are neither lies nor truth, but both and neither. Realizing this as theoretically true and then putting it into practice results in speaking less. The Stoics speak less to people, think you should, because you grasp the objective truth, and then you don't have to talk so much. But we should speak less, for the skeptics as well, and have freedom from fear and more happiness. The next Pyrrhonian was Anaximenes, who took up Pyrrho and Timon's skepticism in Alexandria, Egypt in the 1st century CE. This leaves a gap between the death of Timon around 230 and Anaximenes, who was living after the year 0. So this lives over a 200-year gap that we don't know exactly who and whom was in here. Clearly, the works of Timon and possibly other followers of Pyrrho had survived. Alexandria was the capital of Alexander's empire, which he chose to place in Egypt, and it remained one of the greatest centers of ancient knowledge for centuries. Its library, known as the Library of Alexandria, one of the wonders of the world, was said to contain all the texts of the ancient world that could be acquired, many having been looted by Alexander and his armies. It is still said that someone set fire to the library. Some blame the Romans. Some blame the Muslims. In fact, it is a Christian version, and I have in more than one published book, they have the account blaming the Muslims. And the Muslims famously say, if it isn't the Quran, we can burn all the learning. Nobody who had much familiarity with Islam would say, though, they burn all books except the Quran. Where does algebra come from? And a whole lot of science that's the roots of modern science aplenty, which is the gathering of the ancient world in India and Greece and everything. And then Europeans take that and take off with the Renaissance and pre-modernity into a bunch of stuff. But the library was probably not a building. Many people went looking for the library and that it had been burned as a building, but it turns out it probably was a set of scrolls and shelves along a hallway in some other temple, and it's a library like I have a library behind me, but I don't have my own private building. It's all in my central living room studio here because I don't have a separate library. I do have a library, just not a separate one from myself as a building with a doorway. So it's probably several thousand shelves on a long, long shelf or several, and not, again, as archaeologists originally suspected. Though many did say it was either burned by Julius Caesar in 48 CE, or possibly Muslims who did not think books other than the Quran are books, even though they were the ones who were in contact with China and the foldy books in the middle. Anaximenes' major work, Pyrrhonian Discourses, did not survive. Notice he is in Pyrrhonian Discourses, giving props to Pyrrho. He is known to have argued against members of Plato's Academy and Stoics about beliefs they strongly asserted, here is the kung fu battles between schools, even as they admitted degrees of skepticism. Like a Jain or a Buddhist logician from India, Anaximenes argued things could be quite true at certain times and places, but quite untrue at others, and human conceptions are incapable of revealing more to us than this. He was known for arguing this with his 10 tropes, 10 recurring themes or points he often made. These are very awesome. In fact, I would say Taoists and Jains and Buddhists of China and India and other Greek skeptics we've already covered, like Heraclitus, Democritus, and others, they do use these sorts of things. And in fact, Sextus, whom we will have next, tries to sum these up into two, namely the circle and the line. And I will talk about that because the problem of the circle and the line I then will go on to talk about with modern European philosophy next semester, because it is good to mention the circle and the line in Greek skepticism and then mention Descartes writes privately into letters, I think with this, I think therefore I am, therefore God, state, and science. I think I can get over skepticism. And I don't like Peronean skepticism, is what Descartes says, brought to us by skeptics, Sextus specifically from Pyrrho. And he says, I think, therefore I am, which is very Avicenna of the Islamic world. I think that can surmount skepticism and arrive in certain dogmatism and thus European later rationalism. A to B to C, much more like Aristotle, and more deductive rather than purely inductive. Horses kind of have four legs so far. This is very induction versus deduction. Skepticism, always inductive, trying to remain open, versus deductive. Once I close out an A, always no B. Do I? All places, all times, as the Buddhists say? Really? And Sextus, really? If all times and all places, then I can assume B if I know A. That is A, and that's logic, as Tweedledum and D say to Alice. So the 10 tropes are very important, and I'm going to boil those down into the circle and the line next, and then that will serve as a wonderful introduction for skepticism. And there is La Cucaracha and the truck with awesome foodstuffs for the workers, yammering and hammering and beeping away right outside. So the top floor is getting put in of the building outside, so over the winter break, hopefully, I can lecture at length all morning and evening without noise either time. But here, let's have the 10 tropes. So Anicedemus says Pyrrho has, and skeptics have 10 tropes, 10 themes, 10 points, 10 strategies, as it were, like the Jains 3, I mentioned 2. Those 10 tropes are: various animals perceive things differently. Keep in mind, we are an animal. Various people perceive things differently. One person can perceive things differently as contradictory, here from different places or times or perspective. You look at the backside of a table. Perception varies from one time to another. That's somewhat the earlier point. Perception varies from one place to another. The Buddhists specifically, Buddhists against Hindus in debate would say, is it in all times? Is it in all places? And to all same extents. These are specifically, these tropes, often specific debate, skeptical points of Buddhists. Why? Because we have minds that believe in doubt and argue with others, and we have similar forms of life, is the best explanation I think I will ever give you on this, and then we can hopefully enjoy these differences and similarities and continue to learn more about ourselves and everyone. So X is not always Y. A is not always B. Why? Because there's time and there's place and different parts of the elephant. Things are perceived through media is number 6. Not just Fox or MSNBC for Americans, BBC for the Brits, 1 versus 2 versus 3, such as air or water. These are sailors. If you yell underwater and somebody's underwater trying to save you from drowning, the words would sound very weird and muffled. And the Greeks do seem aware here, and ancient people would not have really tried to yell in a vacuum or vacuum pumped air out of anything, and nor would they have gotten to space, with the astronaut suits. But it does seem here they are somewhat aware that air and wind carries words and breath, although they probably thought about that very different from us, of course. But they are aware that words are breath, so if there wasn't air in the air, then where do words go or how do they work? That, again, is not their knowledge of vacuums or lack of sound in a vacuum, which would be very fascinating, but not what something like it, though, in the same ballpark, sort of, or next door. And that would be air and water and yelling in water or not, or seeing and hear that an oar. I used to watch Mr. Wizard as a kid, and he would put a straw in a glass. If any of you remember Mr. Wizard or know what that is, you youngins, and it's for your time. And that it looks broken like an oar. The Greeks did not have straws. We don't often in Berkeley, yes, because of the sea turtles. But because, no matter how you feel about that, you can see the straw or the oar bent in the water for sailors or others, and that would be water, air, and some sort of difference of perspective. With the straw in the water or anything in a glass of water or pencil, if you don't have straws, yeah, you can see the air in the water at the same time, almost, but not entirely in the same place, showing you a difference of perspective, like the duck rabbit optical illusion, but not even, well, I guess the glass of water and pencil is all, each of them arranged and built and then arranged by us, but that's pretty a la natural. The things, number 7, the things we perceive change continuously in size, color, and temperature. They do. Wittgenstein actually says if cheese changed radically in size all of a sudden, we would not have pricing of cheese like we do. Thankfully, cheese does, mold, change size, some like that, pay high prices. But in fact, cheese does change, but slightly enough, and if you refrigerate it, such that we can price cheese. Think about that. Cheese changes slowly enough. The universe changes slowly enough. We have regularity. Perceptions, number 8, perceptions are relative and interact with each other. That is interesting. It's again, our thoughts affect our thoughts. Perceptions become weaker after repetition, becoming custom. We'll have Sextus Empiricus says old people, they're more sensitive to loud noises and things like that. You do have that something like more or less sensitivity in individuals. If somebody likes a bunch of vinegar on everything, they're not as sensitive to it. It would be something everyone, people would notice in ancient and tribal times, maybe even whether or not they had vinegar. Somebody eats more hot peppers, and gets taken out more or less by jaguars or not, is that, individuals do react to things variously. I'll leave more of that to Sextus because he has remarkable examples of all these. And he tries to sum them up into 2 out of the 10, which is quite cool. And the final one here, thus, of the 10, people are raised in various cultures under various laws and customs. Watch my talks on Taoism. You will find people saying, well, if those people don't wear purple pants, who knows what is true? They don't say purple pants. That's me. That's Berkeley here a little bit. But yeah, if there's different cultures, who knows what is true? Well, ancient people and tribes were encountering different cultures, encountering people wearing purple pants, having different gods as they were moving from polytheism to monotheism, and saying, well, if your fire god isn't exactly my fire god, as Heraclitus is saying of the Thracians and others who have red-haired, Xenophanes, Heraclitus are pointing out the Thracians have red-haired gods. I think that's Xenophanes specifically. So that would be cultural types. Notice we started with different kinds of animals, then had different individuals. We also have different cultures. Human beings would the whole world over, having myths about the fox or the fox spirit, see animals like and unlike ourselves, individuals like and unlike ourselves, and tribes and cultures unlike and like ourselves, and like ourselves in the 60s, and otherwise they would be coming to more dogmatic versus skeptical perspectives on other cultures, other individuals, other animals, and dogmatism versus skepticism and perspective. Again, when we boil it down to simple pieces, it's not obvious this is completely correct. I don't want to paint it that way because, again, to be the better Hegelian here, I'm not a full Hegelian, I'm relative-ish, Hegel-ish. There's dogmatism and skepticism in your life. These are things you deal with, whether or not you are more dogmatic or skeptical about religion, politics, science, art, people. These are going to be forms you deal with. The philosophers or scientists or artists you listen to will be pitching different angles of this stuff at you because we are human beings and share similar forms of life. That does not tell you whether or not to side with Aristotle or Pyrrho, but Hegel says that is what Wittgenstein would more call not the Jane elephant, but the duck rabbit. I like referring to that as the duck rabbit, the objective and subjective truth in front of us. And these are the ways of reading Wittgenstein's duck rabbit and the world as objective and subjective truth. So like the modern Scottish philosopher Hume, who we will mention again soon, and I'll do a lecture about next semester or 2, Anaximenes argued that cause and effect cannot be known physically, but only via mental conception, which would be more like wording it out, not inner mind necessarily here in the ancient world. The mind witnesses 2 events and links the 2 together with a concept, which then becomes a customary prejudice. While it is useful to assume that things will follow in accord with conceptions, this may, for as all we know, be only true under certain conditions and not others. We'll talk about pragmatism also, and American pragmatism and Wittgenstein. How do you know that you're not, that this is all times and spaces? And on the other side of Alpha Centauri, there are no cold blue fires. How do you know that? Well, you know it as best you can, don't you? A la induction paired with deduction interwoven. And Ecedemus was also a follower of the work of Heraclitus, my favorite of the Greek philosophers, although I do love Sextus because he is sort of a later, more comprehensive Heraclitus. Heraclitus argued that opposites co-determine each other and can both be present at one and the same time in the same thing, unlike Aristotle, who says in the same time and place there must be at least some categorical truths. Many of the 10 tropes are similar to the thinking of Heraclitus, who also argues that things are variously perceived using the examples of various animals, as the Taoists do. I love pointing out the parallels of Heraclitus says, is human language different from apes to the gods? Do we look any different to the gods? And Chuang-Tzu, my favorite Taoist, says, are human words any different from the peeps and of baby birds trying to be fed? Yes, impression. Well, they are and they are not, is actually what the Taoist is inviting you to see, and how so and how not so. Well, in some way, everything I tell you is kind of a, kind of animal sound. It is. And then is my whining ever entire or complete? Certainly not. So next, we will have Sextus Empiricus, and he lived around 160 to 210. So other side over here, along in, again, Greco-Egypt, Rome, and all of that. And we'll have another talk on that and Greek skepticism next. So much happiness. I'm going to post this along with some of the Aristotle today. Much happiness, and again, I'm Eric Airlock, and I will see ya if I ever see ya.